I have a feeling that when you saw this title, you thought, wait, can Luffy read? When this question first came to mind, I felt like he should be able to read, but I couldn't remember an instance of him reading, which is why I decided to go through the manga and see if I could find any instance of Luffy reading. So, I'm going to lay out for you what I found arc by arc in the manga, and I've said manga twice because I want to establish some very clear ground rules for this video. I am only looking at the manga, and I'm not looking at extra media such as the anime, the novels, or the video games, because that is just too much extra information to go over, and we could argue the canonicity of any of these forms of media. Like, did Luffy really play for the Dodgers? Who knows? Also, if we include the video games, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be too hard to find an instance of Luffy reading because you read all the time in video games. In fact, the longest book I probably ever read is the Metal Gear Solid series, which you could probably rent at your local library. Oh wait, you can! Support your local libraries. They're amazing! We've established the ground rule of only the manga. Now this rule might seem really strange, but reading is not just recognizing words or symbols. Reading requires higher cognitive ability. So if Luffy recognizes the symbol for the Marines, that does not necessarily mean he can read. It just means he can recognize these letters as symbolizing the Navy. Just like I can recognize this kanji as meaning love because of Gaara from Naruto. I can recognize certain words or phrases, but it doesn't mean I can read Japanese or kanji. And that's even with taking a semester of Japanese in college. Use it or lose it, folks. The way this video is going to be structured is I'm going to go arc by arc to note if Luffy has any reading feats or any anti-reading feats in the series. Yes, I'm power scaling Luffy's ability to read in this video. I'm going to note any possible instances of potentially reading in the first part of the video. Then, the next part I'm going to analyze the scene for context and make a reasonable analysis whether or not, given everything in the scene, it is strong or weak evidence for Luffy reading. Also, just for fun, I'm going to have this chart of whether or not certain characters can read. Those characters will include Straw Hats and some Husbandos. So we have can read confirmed, then probably couldn't read but no hard evidence. Then we have no evidence they can read. I want to be clear that I need concrete evidence for the reading to be in the top part. So, like I know that Law is an unlicensed medical professional doctor who probably has read some books, but is there hard evidence in the series that he has read a book? In his case, he can go in the probably can read tier, but no clear evidence. Ace may be the second commander of the Whitebeard Pirates, but is reading a requirement for that job? I don't know if Whitebeard became the strongest by encouraging his crew members to go to the library. So Ace is in the can't read until I find evidence otherwise. And I can already hear people justifying why Ace doesn't need to know how to read because he is just too pretty. But stick around to find out the true answer. Let's start our journey to see if Luffy and a few others can read. It all begins at dawn. Romance Dawn. If you don't know if adult Luffy can read, what makes you think he can read as little Luffy? Luffy doesn't read here, and Lucky Roo draws him a picture of a devil fruit. Meant to be an artist, forced to be a pirate. Luffy probably doesn't realize the irony of him wearing an Anchor t-shirt, and Shanks probably gave him that shirt to bully him. Well, that is if Shanks can read. No reading feat, so we skip ahead to the East Blue. We have our first potential instance of Luffy reading when he declares we are at the Marines base, while there is the Marines logo here. So this is counter 1 for Luffy potentially reading in chapter 3. And I'm going to list these and then analyze them later, so stick around. At the Marine base, we recruit Zoro. I have to place Zoro in the no evidence category for now because I couldn't recall him reading at the time of going through the series. So, bottom tier. The mini Buggy arc comes and Zoro's part of the crew. We abandon Kobe and meet Nami. So I know Nami is literate and can read, but at this point in the series, she can't. And I'm not including a skill like reading a map under it being able to read. So technically, as the Buggy arc, the Straw Hats are illiterate. Maybe that's why Luffy beats up clowns and random old men. Maybe it's some type of revenge for Garp not teaching him how to read and abandoning him in the forest. Anyway, the townspeople chase Luffy out of town, and we are in Syrup Village, where Luffy might not have any potential reading feats, but we got our main man, Usopp. In Syrup Village, Usopp doesn't explicitly prove he can read, but one of his little veggie pirates wants to be a writer, and the townsfolk read, so it's possible Usopp was educated at a local school despite being oh so alone. And he packs a book in chapter 41 in his big backpack. Usopp seems to be the type of person who can read and becomes a jack of all trades, so we could put Usopp in the probably literate category until we have hard proof of him reading later. Though right after, we get Nami recognizing Arlong's bounty poster. But I am very rarely going to include bounty posters as being able to read on this list because it could just be something everybody knows and you can recognize you are wanted without needing to read it. So Nami still stays in the probably can read, but no proof yet category. Similarly, we could do that for Sanji the next arc. At this point in the manga, there is no definitive proof that he can read. I went through all these chapters and like, okay, he's got to be reading a book or something. But no, not in his backstory. However, it is reasonable to assume he can read because Zeph has all these books in his room and trained Sanji to cook. And I was ready to say that he probably reads the menus to the customers, but the Baratier has no menus in the manga. So Sanji we got to put in the probably literate category until further notice. Next we move on to Arlong Park, where we find out that reading is a part of Nami's trauma. When she was young, she could read very well. She even tried to steal a book that wasn't part of the trauma. But the Arlong pirates went and locked her away because they found out how well she could read and write. And so, that's her tragic backstory. And strangely enough, she isn't the only Straw Hat with reading as part of her tragic backstory. We can comfortably move Nami into the can read with evidence category. As for Luffy, he has officially destroyed more books than he has read in this series. I mean, to be fair, he has read 0 books, and by my rough estimates, he destroys 76 books in Nami's room. This scene is also unintentionally funny if you picture Luffy destroying the books because he can't read instead of it being for Nami. It's kind of funny, but being unable to read is not funny, so make sure that you learn. At the end of this arc, we see Luffy acknowledging that he is a wanted man and is worth 30 million berries. We'll mark this as number 2 for a potential reading fee, but I can tell you right now that this is pretty weak evidence. Surprisingly, there are no reading feats in Logtown. I thought there'd be something with a price, but there was nothing. Alabasta Saga. Reverse Mountain and Whiskey Peak, there are no reading feats, but Vivi joins the crew. In Little Garden in chapter 116, Usopp mentions he read a book, but again, we are going with hard proof, so he stays in the probably can read category. Because I mean, he might just be lying to prove he is cool. No reading while inside of this arc, as the crew is too busy getting covered in white goo. However, right after, in chapter 130, Vivi confirmed she can read by reading a newspaper of trouble in Alabasta. She moves up to the can read with concrete evidence. What a literate queen. Also, this does come up a lot, so let's address it now. There are times where a character is holding a newspaper, but we have no proof that they are actually reading the newspaper. Sometimes they might literally be searching for a picture of their friend because there was no social media in One Piece. At least I don't think so. That would be quite strange if there was. Could you imagine? Vivi is reading the newspaper out loud, so she can clearly read. It's with this information that we decide to go to Drum Island. We get to recruit our doctor friend, Tony Chopper. I was hoping he would be literate the moment we met him, but he is only in the probably literate category as he is likely a licensed doctor, as I'm sure Dr. Kureha would make him take the licensure exam, and he has a ton of books. But you know how I mentioned other Straw Hats had reading as part of their trauma? Yeah, Chopper's tragic backstory in 143 and 144 is him basically killing Dr. Kureha because he doesn't know how to read. He thought the Jolly Roger meant it cured all. Chopper does flip through books, but he just saw a symbol and thought, oh, that was good, when it was not. And I know that I'm laughing throughout this. Chopper's backstory makes me cry so much, but it's just ridiculous in the context of this video. But I think the lesson is that if you're a doctor and don't know how to read, you may kill your patients. Maybe that's why Law is called the Surgeon of Death. Anyway, I'm sure Chopper will move to the literate category, but for now, we're off to the desert of Alabasta, where we get to meet our favorite himbo, Ace. In Ace's introduction in chapters 156 and 159, There is no proof he can read. He is asleep and has Luffy's wanted poster, which again, I'm not counting those for literacy. This restaurant also doesn't have any table menus, but they got this little sign here, which, I don't know, might be their drink specials, but Ace is not literate right now, and I would put him in the no evidence category. But all of Crocodile's crew is proven to be literate in chapter 165, as he makes them all read a letter. Surprisingly, Robin isn't pictured reading, so I can't move her up. This also means Crocodile is capable of reading, reasonably, and there are instances in the future where he does read. So we get the confirmed literate crew of Crocodile, and the questionably literate crew of the Straw Hats. Now, we get a potentially strong instance of Luffy being able to read. In 169, there is a sign that says VIP to the left and Pirates to the right. Luffy says, hey, let's go to the pirate side, and they fall for a trap. We'll put this down as a possible time that Luffy has read. Usopp has a writing feat in that he wrote Nami a manual, and I think you could reasonably assume that he can read. We'll put him in the reading tier a bit early. Fun fact, there are 0 instances of reading for Zoro. In fact, Zoro's master taught him about how swords should not cut paper, so he might respect books more than Luffy. We could also add Robin to the can read category. Our literate queen even reads in a language that is lost. If we... oh shit. Her backstory has reading trauma too. Okay, 3 Straw Hats have reading trauma. Sky Island arc. In Jaya, we get an instance of Luffy potentially reading. He looks over Nami's shoulder to read a book with no pictures in chapter 228. We'll put that in the potentially yes column, even if I'm tenuous on that. More concrete and somehow less concrete example is in Sky Island, where in chapter 295, Luffy and Nami are on top of a giant beanstalk and drop a written note on the leaf. We got our counter up to 4 possible reading ability out of 300 chapters so far. They then literally fall from heaven. Water 7. My hot take is that I love the Foxy arc so much, and surprisingly, this is home to an instance of Luffy potentially reading. It happened in chapter 315, where he goes into the infirmary to meet Nurse Foxy. Not a Foxy nurse, unless you think Foxy is Foxy, which everybody does, in which case it is the Foxy Nurse Foxy. But yeah, this is actually pretty strong evidence. It brings the counter up. We'll analyze more later, and we got another decently strong indicator of Luffy's ability to write and potentially read. Here he draws Franky, and he writes mechanic or shipwright, depending on the translation. And I know being able to write, again, doesn't mean you can necessarily read, but we'll include it now and discuss it later. So far it seems pretty good that Luffy can read, but in chapter 435 we get official confirmation that our boy, Zoro, can actually read. He's reading that newspaper, and there are no if, and, or buts. So he's officially gonna go into the can read part of our list. He actually just beats Franky. Franky, I didn't give him an official spot by virtue of his job, and I haven't seen him read a book. A map, sure, but I'm not counting that skill, so he's in the probably literate, but needs more evidence category. Okay, we're going to categorize the rest of the pre-time skip together, because for the sake of the Straw Hats, there's really not too much there. Brook joins the crew, and he can read music, and the music has lyrics. And I'm usually a little bit more stingy with putting somebody in the can read category, because reading a map, there's certain words on there. But Brook, I remember reading, and so I'm going to put him in the can read category, even if just a little bit early. Then we get to Amazon Lily, where they try to pimp Luffy out, but he recognizes it. In this sign here, in chapter 522, they ask people to pay to touch him, and Luffy is rightfully shocked because he read the sign, right? Potentially so. So we're going to put this down. All right. Then there's really not too much reading in like Impel Down or Marineford, right? Luffy's not stopping to read a book in the middle of battle, right? And so we get to Luffy's backstory. And we get one instance of Luffy writing. He writes, Hey everybody, future me here. I just wanted to address that there are multiple translations for this note. One says I owe you treasure, one says we'll pay when I find treasure dash Luffy, and those are two very different things. And so, I consulted the original translation. I found it, I used my Google Translate, and it says worth it. So, I don't know exactly what this note says. There's probably some localization to make it make more sense, as Japanese is a pretty contextual language. But I don't think my conclusion changes very much at the end of the video, but I just wanted to address this because I want it to be rather thorough. First, it's pretty much confirmed that pre-time skip, all the Straw Hats minus Luffy can read. I completely forgot that pre-time skip, they were all reading a newspaper about the unfortunate news about Luffy, and so every Straw Hat minus Luffy can read confirmed pre-time skip. And honestly, I'm just going to throw Jinbei in there right away right now. He can read, as shown in the canon cover story of his journey. So, all the Straw Hats minus Luffy can read. We got that out of the way. Now, the pre-time skip Husbandos. Let's see if your favorite Husbando can read. I didn't include all of them. I included a couple. First, can Ace read and beat the allegations? Well, yes, he actually can read. In the AL backstory, he reads Sabo's letter, proving that he can read. In a similar vein, in the same backstory, Sabo can read and write and is well educated. So, you don't need to say they were too pretty to read because they can all read. Now, the supernovas. Plenty of Husbandos here. We get confirmation that Drake, Beige, Urogue, Apoo, and Hakwins can read. These pamphlets are dropped from the sky, and they read and react appropriately. Hakwins, admittedly, is just kind of staring blankly, but he's a rather monotone character in general, being a bit generous here. The other supernovas confirm read. We could put them in the can read category with evidence. Now, notice that we did not confirm Law or Kid. They were inside a building, and they were not proven literate yet. So, next up is Whitebeard in chapter 552, who proves he can read, so obviously he made sure Ace could read before joining the crew. In 592, Mihawk can read, and I wouldn't be surprised if there was an earlier instance, but hey, our sophisticated gentleman can read. Kobe proves he can read in chapter 87 in the cover story, and I'm including him in the Husbandos list because of post-time skip, of course, and he might even be dating Sakazuki's daughter, and that's just a legend right there. Now, the final person on this Husbando run, who I found out could read, was a Eustass Captain Kidd. He just made the cutoff in chapter 594 where he proves he can read, and he actually reads quite a lot in the series, and reads the newspaper quite often. Maybe our own literate king. Now, a couple of surprising people who I couldn't confirm if they were able to read or not pre-time skip. Shanks. This shouldn't be too shocking, as he generally doesn't appear very much in the series, so we can't actually see if he reads or not. Then we get our Surgeon of Death, Law. I was kind of surprised, but I couldn't find an instance of him reading. I was fully expecting a newspaper or something pre-time skip, but no. Law hasn't shown he can read pre-time skip, so the notion that Captain Kidd is dumber than Law is misguided so far. Then I didn't keep track for Buggy and a bunch of other potential Husbandos. Let me know if you want a follow-up video with other characters in the future and list them below. Okay. And we're saving Luffy for the very end of the video. Fishman Island and Punk Hazard. There isn't really a reading feat at Fishman Island or Punk Hazard, but there is an anti-reading feat. So, stick with me here. In 650, it shows how uninformed Luffy is in world issues. It's like he literally lived on an island with no access to modern news. Who would have thought? Now, why is that relevant? It's because Luffy just doesn't seem to understand newspapers in general, and that might be why he's uninformed and not just the isolation. Because in chapter 699, he is staring at his picture in the newspaper and asks, why is it there? So this is an anti-reading feat because he doesn't seem to read at all. He just kind of blankly stares at it with just spend 5 seconds and oh, that's the story. And this is also a common theme where Luffy just kind of stares at a newspaper or a text. But let's go on to the next one. Cover story 756. I'm giving this chapter its own section because in this one, Luffy writes the word Mugiwara, and being able to write without being able to read is possible, but it's also a cover story. Some are canon, like how Jinbei reads in chapter 760. However, there are some kind of just artsy covers I won't count for or against, because then Nami and Usopp would be a streamer with no internet unless the Den Mushis are the internet. But again, this is kind of why I've been a little bit selective. If there's a storyline attached to a cover story, I can count as an instance of reading. Otherwise, I'm just not gonna consider it evidence in the manga. Zone Whole Cake Island. In chapter 814, Sanji decides to leave the crew, and Luffy's staring intently at the note, saying that when Sanji says he's going to meet a woman, that means he's getting married. That is probably one of the stronger pieces of evidence for him reading, but we will come back to it later as well. In 824, Pedro shows Luffy a newspaper. He grabs it. He stares at the newspaper. Nami grabs it, then reads it out loud. So close. Chapter 825. Sanji reads porn and Chopper finds it. Chapter 903. We get a bounty chapter, and Luffy misreads his bounty, so this might be an anti-reading feat, but I think that's a little too much because even I have trouble counting that many zeros, and that's kind of boss that he can say that. Alright, now when Wano, Egghead, and Elbaf, I'm grouping these together because there aren't too many instances of reading from the crew, and I want to preserve some stamina after going through all of this. In 910, Luffy looks at the newspaper. 1063 pushes a button that says fashion, he pushes one that says like steak, chapter before. None of these really indicate any particular form of literacy, just that he likes to look at pretty things or dress pretty, I guess. But in chapter 1000, if Yamato joins the crew, then right there, appropriately in chapter 1000, we have another literate straw hat. That's why he gave it the special number. And yeah, that's really it in post-time skip. There's substantially less instances of reading, or at least ones that I thought were potentially noteworthy, at least in regards to Luffy. But what about in regards to the Husbandos? Ooh. So we have a few more himbos who've earned the right to read. It's those gentlemen from earlier. They're back. And what is more, is that Buggy, the legend, the goat, the clown, may have even taught Shanks how to read. In chapter 964, Buggy is reading out loud to Shanks, indicating potentially that Shanks couldn't read and that Buggy was teaching him. You call it a stretch, I call it the truth. We see the world differently. And it was a close one for Shanks, as I didn't have concrete proof that Shanks could read until later. Admittedly, I was being stingy as he stares at Luffy in the newspaper post time skip, and you could probably even say he reads it. But I didn't get official confirmation until when he fought against Kid. It is confirmed that Shanks can read. He can read, confirmed, and we finally got our literate king. And Law can read too. He is shown being taught by his parents about medicine and he is writing. Here I think it's reasonable that he can read. So, can Luffy read? A super interesting thing I found during this experiment is that pre-time skip Luffy tends to have more potential reading ability than time skip Luffy. There are more times where it seems like Luffy might be able to read than him being illiterate. While in time skip, there are more anti-feats than actual reading feats. The first group I'm going to analyze is stuff I don't think is good evidence for him reading at all. One of the things I want to reiterate before my analysis is recognizing singular words or symbols doesn't count as reading for the sake of this video. It's why anything with a bounty poster I generally don't recognize as reading. So chapter 96, when Luffy sees his wanted man, I don't consider that reading as we may know it. And it was very generous to call chapter 3 a reading feat just because there were the words Marines at the Marine base. These pieces of evidence aren't good evidence, as I would think he would recognize the word Marine because grandfather's in the Marine, and I think he would recognize the bounty posters because that's kind of a symbol of something he aspires to be. And so none of these will count for good reading feats, or at least I don't think they're good evidence here. Similarly, in chapter 228, Luffy looks over Nami's shoulder at a book and there are no pictures. I mean, this doesn't prove that he can read, Usopp is next to him, and Luffy tends to follow Usopp's lead, as shown when he just copied Usopp's reaction to Nami flashing them, and that was stated by Oda. So, I don't think this is a good reading. Chapter 295. It's possible that that giant leaf, Luffy wrote that note and has some functional form of literacy or writing ability, but it's also possible that Nami wrote this. So for this one, I can't really say if it is Luffy. It is such an outlier of what we have seen him do, and I don't think it's him. And in chapter 910, him staring at a newspaper isn't necessarily him reading, but looking for a picture of Vivi. In chapters 1062, Luffy's naming a bunch of food while pushing a button. He says steak, where the button says steak. But this could easily be him just wanting certain food or acknowledging what's coming out. In 1063, he gets new clothes because he wandered to a place called Fashion, but knowing Luffy, he just wandered randomly wherever, and it doesn't mean he can read that sign. So, those are the pieces of evidence that I think are rather weak for saying that he can read. The next set of pieces of evidence is a little stronger, but not by much. It's in 169 with him reading the word pirate and choosing to go that way. At best, Luffy's able to read the word pirate. At worst, he's able to recognize the word pirate and understand that the arrow means go right. This is a little stronger, but I don't know if it shows that he can read, and he didn't read VIP, Usopp did. So, it's rather weak, and again, Luffy aspired to be a pirate, so he should recognize the word. Chapters 315 and 522 are pretty decent pieces of evidence that Luffy can read. Chapter 315, he reads the word infirmary. Hey everybody, future me back again, and we've got two slightly different translations again. One that says they've got one of those, and one that says what kind of room is that after he reads infirmary. And so the one where it says they've got one of those indicates this is what he's familiar with, so he might potentially recognize the word infirmary, and he probably encountered a hospital at some point in his life. The second one, what kind of room is that, indicates that he's unfamiliar with this word, and that he is more genuinely reading this or sounding this word out. So I consulted the Japanese RAWs and put it through Google Translate, and I got, is there such a thing? Which tends to favor the, they've got one of those translation. Luffy is shocked that they have an infirmary aboard the Foxy pirate ship, and he's likely seen a hospital in the past, so it makes sense. The second translation, what kind of room is that, is interesting, because on one hand, it makes him seem more airheaded as he somehow doesn't know what an infirmary is. And on the other hand, and it makes him a little bit smarter because this is a pretty solid example of him reading. But since it's the first translation, this is less strong evidence than I would have thought that it would be for Luffy's ability to read. 522 is one where in Amazon Lily, they hold a sign that says 1 touch is 20 berry. And this seems like a solid piece of evidence that he can read. He says, you're charging me? However, the panel before this person says people want to touch him, and he ideally recognizes the symbol for money, especially the term goal. So I think this is solid, but the context makes it a little bit more tenuous, because he probably recognizes the word goal for wanting to be an adventurer, and if he listens to what the person was saying, then he can easily come to that conclusion. Now, a pretty strong piece of evidence is in chapters 814 and 813. Luffy stares at the note and seemingly reads the note, saying, when Sanji meets a woman, and it being in quotation marks indicate it is a direct quote from the note. The problem is the context again, with the note being found in the previous chapter by Brook and company. It was then likely explained to Luffy by the crew. Then again, it is possible that they just gave him the note and then explained afterwards, because they start discussing the note after singing a song. Luffy also looks like he's either disturbed by the note or he has trouble reading it. Either way, this and probably the infirmary scene are the best pieces of evidence I found of Luffy being able to read in this manga. And so what does that mean for his ability to read? Well, let's go to the conclusion. So, that question in the title, can Luffy read? Well, the short answer is yes, but not very well. If I had to estimate, based on what we have seen so far, he is probably as literate as a 5-year-old at best. If I gave him the cat in the hat, he may be able to read it, or at least recognize words. I'm not sure if he would recognize the grammar of the language and be able to read it fluently. He might read rather slowly as he is interpreting and sounding out the words, which we love to hear because it shows he has an understanding of text. Fun fact, Luffy's literacy ability also changes very mildly depending on which version you read. I read a combination of the colored version, which I believe is official, and then various fan translations. In the colored version or potentially official version, he could read the word infirmary, and he can write a decent sentence about treasure. And he's mildly more literate than in the other version. He might just recognize the word infirmary, he knows IOU, but not necessarily the sentence structure. I also know that I've been using the word literacy and reading interchangeably when in fact, literacy is a bit more complex than reading. Literacy basically encompasses your ability to navigate the world and its various systems, the most common forms being reading, writing, and speaking. And when I look at Luffy through this lens, that I would still call him functionally literate, even if he has rather low reading ability. He can recognize words such as treasure, gold, marine, pirate, infirmary, and is able to navigate the world effectively and compensate for his weaknesses. It is a central theme of One Piece of everyone in the crew working for the betterment of everyone. Every person has a skill that the others are not as adept in, and it's through their teamwork they're able to conquer the world. Luffy can't cook or navigate or perhaps even read well in this case, but he finds a way to supplement for these in order to live his best life possible, so I think calling Luffy functionally illiterate wouldn't be accurate. And yeah, that's basically it. Luffy could read like a 5-year-old at best, and that makes sense thematically too, right? He needs to be uninformed so things can be explained to the reader, and so him not being able to read well makes sense. Thank you for watching, everyone. I know there's an insert or two in the manga of Luffy encountering text that I saw while editing this video, like right here. Luffy sees a story of Ace, the newspaper, and comments on the ship and his crew, which are things you don't need to read, but you could just stare at it and be like, oh yeah, ship and crew. But by all means, you could call this little scene reading if you want to. You've earned it, especially if you stuck around to the end of the video. It was a long one. Thanks for watching. Comment your favorite hymnal or any thoughts you have about the video. I'm sure that I missed a few things going through the 1,000+ chapters of One Piece. And with all that being said, like, comment, subscribe, and thank you for being born, y'all. Peace out.